Introduction. The Arab Spring. Millions of immigrants streaming into Europe, disquiet in Hungary and Brazil, Brexit, an inflamed mob storming the capital, demonstrations in Tel Aviv's Balfour Street, where the PM's official home is located, and riots in Israel. Is it a mere coincidence that all these events occurred in the same decade? The idea behind writing this book emerged a year before the first letter was actually typed on the very first page, but I couldn't free up time for it. I was busy with my students, with my robots, with equations, and then I got to the point where I said, enough. I took a 6-month writing break from my job and everything that had comprised my life up until then. As chance would have it, the first COVID-19 quarantine was announced on the day when my writing vacation officially began. Poof. My writing break evaporated. The book, however, profited. The phenomena I had only imagined actually took shape, one after the other, at full tilt ahead. Live TV broadcasts that showed how the moral norms we lived by, those which society sought to instill in us from earliest times to promote obedience to a nation's laws, instantly became a tool for butting heads with the institutions of government. We could see, for example, how the value of equality was suddenly donning the garb of civil rebellion in the USA, and the sacred value of freedom of speech was turning into the right of the individual to confront the police, all the more so when equipped with firearms. So what suddenly happened? The Arab Spring, a somewhat cynical label for a series of rebellions across the swathe of Arab states, brought Yemen, Syria, and Libya to unprecedented upheaval, culling the lives of hundreds of thousands of people as it drove mass immigration into Europe. How is it that the Arab Spring took place simultaneously to the social revolutions in Western society? The fundamental condition for social stability is stable demography and agreement on shared moral codes. Just about nowhere is it deemed acceptable to walk around fully naked or to brutally strike someone who parked right where you want to put your car. But the moral codes by which we live aren't engraved in stone. They're regularly subjected to comparison with a romanticized version of the past, open to attack and change. Think for a moment about the feminist movement, or communism, or right-wing political movements which accrued worldwide power. But we can also find less consolidated concepts, such as how being white in America leads to a structured preferential status labeled white privilege, which therefore justifies for some forcibly force-suppressing whites. Each of these ideas raises its own banner at increasingly accelerated speeds and changes the way we perceive ourselves, for better and worse. It turns out that we don't have to be great intellectuals to question the moral codes on which a society is based. As we'll see in this book, the ideas that bring about change can often enough be completely stupid, not yet matured, or not even well-defined, such as the banner of equality often flashed around without its meaning being fully clarified. We'll discover that mere persistence can be enough to turn society upside down. As it turns out, that's actually a mathematical fact, which we'll also take a look at in this book. The catalyst for the Arab Spring was sourced in a sudden and swift geopolitical change. George W. Bush decided to go into Iraq and reshuffle its cards. His plan was to change Iraq's social and political structure. The outcome was not sympathetic. In fact, it led to an array of violent events throughout the Middle East. Nonetheless, how is it that all these events occurred within such a short time frame and without anyone directing them? What made the masses in New York, capital of the West, so to speak, screech, defund the police? What drove the figureheads of principal government institutions, from the Prime Minister to the Attorney General in Israel, from the President to the Supreme Court in America, to be met with flames of fury? And how did the very ideal of democracy, central as it is to the beliefs of the majority, suddenly become important only when it served the correct side? That, at least, is how Americans storming the Capitol felt, believing that the government had been stolen from them. It's also how the democratic masses felt in the Black Lives Matter riots that broke out in 2020. Near my home in a kibbutz in Israel's central Emek Hefer region, Musa the shepherd watches his sheep. Other than watching sheep and enjoying the pastoral vista, I love watching Musa. Not for a moment does he sit to play his flute, possibly because he doesn't have one. Instead, he runs around for hours like a madman trying to keep his flock together. They don't like walking in a straight line or in any defined direction. What they love most is scattering around, and they're quite determined to do that. Like Musa's flock, organized human society in the form of the state needs constant oversight. It isn't immune to attacks, which can come from any direction. Make no mistake, a shared cultural foundation and supportive geopolitical environment are no more than the flock's grass and water. In other words, no more than the most basic infrastructure for the state's existence. And this isn't enough anymore. Religious people hate secular people, Democrats can't stand Republicans, leftists loathe rightists, Arabs detest Jews, and everyone is sure that the other side is blind or stupid. In such a situation, what chance does society have to remain stable? Musa's flock numbers 100 sheep, give or take a few, depending on whether a celebration is drawing close. He keeps them under control by using their sense of belonging to him and by wielding his long shepherding crook. The state's citizens also need a sense of security, a feeling of belonging, trust in their governmental institutions, and strict enforcement of the law to prod them back into line every so often. But we currently live in an era where there's room for every possible opinion to be voiced, together with countless approaches to problems arising from living in a group. In fact, in our world, the information-feeding social ideas is predominantly false or biased, but most of us have trouble identifying that. In our current times, when the digital page quietly suffers anything and everything, governmental institutions also find themselves attacked day and night simply because traditional norms of criticism have disappeared. Instead, a different type of critical attitude has developed, one that invades every layer of existence and has no respect for personal boundaries. The social structure into which we were born is therefore at real risk. 50 years worth of life experience leads me to saying that the statement, "Don't worry, it'll all be fine," is generally true. But an individual's life experiences are too narrow to reach this critical conclusion, nor would I depend on it. Indeed, throughout this book, we'll see that throughout the past decade, the social processes influencing social order from time immemorial, which we'll familiarize ourselves with more deeply in Part 1, have become highly effective financial tools in the hands of influential commercial companies that aim to take advantage of human society's weaknesses for their own benefit. Unavoidable processes, like the differentiation of one population from another, which in the past took years, if not generations, are now no big issue. New ideas that grew slowly in the past, often out of distress, now grow wild as weeds in the internet jungle, and the wish for unity, which used to symbolize society's most elevated aspiration, is now being enthusiastically trampled by hate-filled online posts. The past decade then signals a new era in terms of the need for human adaptation to its own outputs. Progress is not just electronics and robots, it's also adaptation and correction of social structures in light of these technological advances. The conclusion we can reach from what we see on TV, from studying history, and from research in the field is that current social structures are no longer able to cope with the frequent changes in how we communicate with each other. If we wish to uphold the society we're accustomed to and love, we need to about turn and define what is permitted or prohibited, what are our society's desirable objectives, and the means for attaining them. There's no point in relying on the familiar democratic method in which organized elections allowed us to vote to correct a government's failures by changing that government. That method's rate of adjustment is aggravatingly slow and has trouble adapting to the rate at which the social world is changing. The old democracy won't survive if we don't adjust it to the new era. This isn't the first time that human society has needed to make deep-seated changes to its manner of existence, changes that require strength of spirit and courage. The previous occasion was in 1945 at the end of World War II, where brave people took human fate into their hands. Today, as then, in order to understand what steps should be taken, we need a deep understanding of the nature of the problems confronting us and their origins. Our Western Spring aims to provide that depth. Blaming society's crumbling on the nature of its leadership, on biased communication, or geopolitical problems of one kind or another, without understanding the weight each carries in the total mix, misses the goal. Our Western Spring takes you on a fascinating journey towards understanding the answers to today's most important questions. This journey begins in psychological, sociological, and even mathematical phenomena that define our realities without us noticing them, and closes with suggestions for a suitable agenda for positive change. You can read this book from start to finish and discover the conceptual structure from the foundation up, but the impatient or eager reader can take a peek at Part 3 and see where the processes described in Parts 1 and 2 lead. Every topic featured in this book is worthy of its own full-fledged discussion, but all topics describe our current reality and offer eye-opening explanations that show where Western society is headed in the foreseeable future.